Good morning, a very good morning to all of you. I hope you're all able to hear me. Okay, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, all right. So it's a pleasure for me to be a speaker at this wonderful workshop. I think the vision for the workshop is the need of the day in academics today, because as has already been pointed out by the opening speakers, there are a lot of tools and techniques. In fact, many of the young budding scholars tend to equate research with tools and techniques, which I think is unfortunate. So I think the theme of doing impactful management research is a wonderful theme and a well-needed dose of reality at this stage in young developing careers. So it's a great pleasure for me to be the inaugural speaker of this really unique workshop. And if I can share my screen. Okay, I'm also struggling with technology here a little bit. 1 second, please bear with me. So are you able to see my full screen?
No, not yet.
Are you able to see it now?
No,
sir.
No, okay, let me see.
You have to click on the present now.
Okay. So is there a button or something that I need to, special button that I need to press here to make
a present now button. Present now button.
Present now button.
Yeah, that's what I did. Let me try again.
Maybe you can close the presentation and start again.
Okay.
Possible.
Okay. Okay, so I'm starting all over again. So present now. Okay, what about now? Are you able to see anything of my screen? No. Okay. I have it open here, but I don't know why it's not showing up. So there's a share button that I'm also. So
Yeah,
the share
you
need to click the tabs here. There are 3 different tabs.
Yeah. But you know, we are also in this screen.
Yeah, it has started.
Yeah, it has come now.
It has come now, right? Okay.
Yes, sir, we can see it.
You can see it? Okay. Okay, let me see if I can go to presentation mode. So are you able to still
Yes,
see
sir.
it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'm not able to see any of the other people, but as long as you're able to see the screen and hear me, I'll proceed. Is that okay?
It's okay.
Yes, sir, sure.
Okay, all right. All right. The title of my address today is Doing Impactful Management Research, Some Personal Reflections. What I wanted to do was to reflect my own career as a researcher that has spanned 45 plus years and take from that research experience some of the personal lessons that I've learned about doing impactful, meaningful research, and then share those with the audience to kick off this 4-day workshop. So the basic agenda for my address consists of just primarily 3 themes. One is firstly to provide a very brief overview of my career and the evolution of my research, right from the start of my career till very recently. And then secondly, to emphasize and highlight the importance and potential impact of doing what I would call programmatic research as opposed to what I would term opportunistic research. By programmatic research, I'm really referring to research that is of a continuing nature. In other words, each research project building on previous research projects and thereby producing a cohesive theme and stream of knowledge, as opposed to opportunistic research, which basically involves doing piecemeal type of research. For example, we have a new technique now, so let's collect some data and see how we can apply the technique. So that type of, opportunistic type of research. So my strong feeling based on my years of research is that it's programmatic research that is likely to be much more impactful, much more useful in terms of generating and disseminating good quality knowledge than piecemeal, helter-skelter type of research, which is more opportunistic. And then I would like to conclude briefly at the end of the talk with some lessons that I've learned and which also sort of translated into suggestions for young scholars and budding researchers. So that's an overview of what I intend to do in my talk. First, a brief overview of my academic history. As you can see here, from 1965 to 1970, I was at IIT Madras, did my BTech in mechanical engineering there. And then from 70 to 72, I was at IIM Ahmedabad to do my Master of Business Administration, my MBA. And then in 1972, I came to the US to do my doctorate in business administration at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. And my formal academic career began in 1975. My first job was at the University of Northern Iowa. From where I was there for 4 years, and I moved to Texas A&M University, where I spent 15 years. And then from there, I moved to the University of Miami, where I just completed 25 years of service. And I just retired from the University of Miami last year, although I still have some association with them. And then since 2019 to the present time, I'm affiliated with Vijayabhumi University, which is a brand new university in Karjat in Greater Mumbai, as some of you might already know. And I'm really looking forward to more visits to India and more involvement. In fact, I was in India for already 3 times in January and February of this year before the COVID crisis hit. And obviously all international travel has halted. So hopefully, God willing, normalcy will return and we don't have to always depend on these virtual interactions, and we'll be able to get back to more face-to-face interaction. So that's a brief overview of my academic history. Now, in terms of the evolution of my research, I have dabbled in a number of different research domains. Now, again, just to very quickly overview this, my dissertation, which as I mentioned, completed at Indiana University, my dissertation research, my doctoral research focused on the topic of sales management and industrial marketing. And I also had a strong interest in the early years of my career in the so-called marketing concept. And my initial 4 years of my career, all of my research revolved around these two major topics. And after I moved to Texas A&M University in 1979, I continued to do research in sales management and industrial marketing, which is where I sort of earned my doctoral stripes, so to speak. Along with to that, I added marketing strategy, which is an outgrowth of the marketing concept type of idea. And then services marketing and service quality, which is what probably most of you know me as being associated with, was a new interest that I developed almost 7-8 years into my career. So I will talk more about that throughout the rest of the talk. But then I also developed an interest in research methodology itself, in particular developing scales to measure, to operationalize constructs in marketing that are much more difficult to operationalize and quantify. So scale development and research methodology became an important part of my research portfolio as well. And then I should also give a lot of credit to two of my colleagues whose names most of you that know about the SERVQUAL model should already be familiar with. One is Dr. Leonard Berry, and the other is Professor Valerie Zeithamel. They are the two people that introduced me to this whole area of services marketing and service quality. As some of you might already know, this particular domain of research was at a very nascent stage in the early 1980s. In fact, the services discipline did not exist as a full-fledged academic discipline prior to 1980. So I garnered a lot of interest in that particular area and started doing research, and I will be talking more about that throughout the rest of the address. And then in the last phase of my research career, which is to say in the last 25 to 30 years, I have been focusing almost exclusively on services marketing and service quality. If you just kind of view this evolution, you will see that I'm not doing any research now in my mother area, so to speak, where I started out with in terms of sales management, industrial marketing, marketing concept, marketing strategy. I'm not doing research in those areas per se anymore. I am doing a lot of research in the area of technology and its impact on service delivery and what technology is doing to quality of service and those kinds of issues. And I continue to be interested in the area of research methodology and scale development. So in a way, through trial and error over the course of my career, I started out with an area where I developed an interest to do my dissertation, which is sales management, industrial marketing, or B2B marketing. And then I started dabbling into a lot of different areas. In fact, this is one illustration here of so-called opportunistic research. In other words, trying to do a little bit here, a little bit there, jumping from topic to topic and so forth. And that is a natural tendency, especially on the part of young scholars, to jump from one topic to another topic, one project to another project, with the goal being, let me publish more papers. Let me get, at least X number of A publications in a certain period of time. Those kinds of motivations are pretty natural. So at some point early in my career, I was all over the place, publishing a lot, but really there was no cohesive theme to it. So over the years, I've tried to narrow the focus, become much more programmatic in my research. And I would say that currently, by currently I mean, starting 25 years ago, I've been staying focused on doing research that relates directly or indirectly to the general area of services and technology is a new component that kind of added to my service research portfolio more recently. So that's to give you a broad overview of how my research started early in my career, and then how it sort of evolved to become much more programmatic. So with that as background, I would like to move on to talk about the importance and potential impact of doing such programmatic and focused research. So in order to do this, I'm going to not talk about all the research that I've done, but I'm basically going to focus on the so-called PZB research stream. PZB or PZB, as they might say in India, stands for the Parasuraman, Zeitamel, Berry, the three co-author team, research journey focused on services. So, as I showed in my academic history chart, my initial interest in my career was in sales management and industrial marketing. And Z stands for Zeitamel, Professor Valerie Zeitamel that I mentioned. She had just finished her PhD in the price, quality, and value area. Professor Leonard Berry was already a senior scholar in 1980, and he had already done a lot of work in the area of relationship marketing and financial services. As luck would have it, all three of us came to Texas A&M. This stands for Texas A&M here. Texas A&M University at about the same time in the 1980-81 period. So the three of us got together, and we really hit it off well as departmental colleagues within the marketing department, and we wanted to do some research together. And so what should we work on? Well, Leonard Berry and Valerie Zeitamel had both already started doing work in the area of services marketing, and I was brand new to services marketing, really didn't know anything about it, but I was well trained in research methodology and techniques and so forth. So the three of us then decided to work on some aspect of services, because as I mentioned at the outset, services as a discipline did not even exist prior to 1980. And fortunately, about the same time, we also got associated with the Marketing Science Institute. Some of you may have heard of the Marketing Science Institute, but for those of you that you have not heard of the Marketing Science Institute, or MSI for short, the Marketing Science Institute is a nonprofit organization that is supported by about 75 or so Fortune 500 companies, and the basic goal or mission of the Marketing Science Institute is to identify areas of keen interest to managers within companies and get serious scholars and academics to do basic research on those areas and topics of interest to managers, so as to develop knowledge that would be directly applicable to the industry. So it's kind of like a matchmaking organization. And the way they do this is once every 2 years, the MSI comes up with a series of research priorities, as they term it. It's just a list of topics that are of keen current interest to various organizations across different sectors. So in the early 1980s, one of the topmost research priorities of the Marketing Science Institute was quality of service. So we picked the topic of service quality as the domain in which we wanted to kick off our research program as a 3-author team. So we made a proposal to Marketing Science Institute, and the proposal got funded, and we launched a research program. And the three of us, the P, Z, and D team, worked together as a team for a span of 15 years. And it is that 15-year slice of my career that I'm going to focus on in my talk today, just as an illustration of what we really mean by programmatic management research. But just to complete the picture here, I want to mention that in the year 1994, I left Texas A&M University and came to the University of Miami, as I showed you on one of the opening slides. But Valerie Zeitamel, Professor Zeitamel, and myself continued to work on electronic service quality, or e-service quality, for another 10 years, along with some other colleagues. And all of this research was sponsored by the Marketing Science Institute. And then beyond 2005, if you look, Professor Berry kind of branched off into healthcare services in the mid-1990s, and he is still very, very active at Texas A&M. He's still at Texas A&M University and still actively doing a lot of very, very important research in the area of healthcare service. I myself have moved into an area called technology readiness of consumers and employees and technology-based service delivery. My colleague, Professor Zeitamel, is working in areas that she terms as service infusion. So we kind of branched off into our own niches, but an overall thing that I wanted to point out here is that even though we have kind of hived off into these different directions, all of us are still basically only are focusing very, very intently on doing research that is within the broad area of service. So that's an important point that I'd like to emphasize. So this is kind of like an overall picture of what a programmatic research stream should look like. So as I said, I'm just going to focus for today's talk on this 15-year research stream, the PZB research journey over this 15-year period. So just to give you a bird's eye view of this 15-year period, it was not one big research project, which is 15 years long, but it is a series of 5 major phases of research, but these are not independent phases. Each phase kind of built on the previous phase and then pushed the boundary forward, so to speak. And that again is an indication of the programmatic nature of this research. So another point that I would like to make, since this, especially since this workshop is on research methodology and doing impactful management research, each phase alternates, the various phases, the 5 different phases alternated between qualitative research and quantitative research, as you can see here. So this is an important point because sometimes young scholars, especially in these days, are under the impression that high quality research is always quantitative. High quality research is research that uses some of the latest techniques and bells and whistles and black boxes, as one of the earlier speakers referred to. That's not necessarily true. High quality research can also be qualitative, especially when you really don't know much about a particular topic. You have to do qualitative research, and qualitative research can also be quite rigorous if done properly. So that's an important point. So our 5 major phases during this 15-year research journey alternated between qualitative and quantitative research. So I'm going to first briefly indicate some of the main outcomes of each of these 5 phases of research, and then I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on each of the phases. And then I will finish up with some concluding remarks about some suggestions for young scholars. The first phase, which was qualitative, produced a so-called GAPS model of service quality. And this is a picture of the GAPS model that appeared in the very first publication that came out in the Journal of Marketing in 1985. I will present a much more reader-friendly version of the GAPS model in a couple of slides later. Phase 2 was quantitative, and this phase produced the so-called SERVQUAL instrument to measure service quality. The third phase was actually a pretty extensive phase that involved a qualitative component as well as a quantitative component. The qualitative component produced what we are calling an extended GAPS model. And again, I will show you a little bit of elaboration of what this extended GAPS model looked like. And then the quantitative part in phase 3 actually focused on doing an empirical test of this extended or full GAPS model. Phase 4 was qualitative, and it actually delved into the nature and determinants of customer service expectations. It was a very involved project, and one of the major learnings from that project, one of the major outcomes of that project was this notion of customer zone of tolerance. And again, I will talk a little bit more about the zone of tolerance a little bit later. And then the final phase was once again quantitative, which built on this phase 2, which was also quantitative, but we had an original SERVQUAL scale here, and then we refined it to produce a new refined SERVQUAL scale that incorporated this idea of zone of tolerance. So again, I'm sorry, I kind of had to rush through this to provide you with a bird's eye view, so that you get a picture of this programmatic type of evolution of my research in roughly a 15-year stretch of my career, early in my career. So what I'd like to do now is to pause for a moment to see if anybody has any questions. Am I making sense? Can somebody enlighten me? Because I don't want to be talking here for an hour without any reaction. So is what I'm saying clear?
Absolutely, sir.
Okay, so I will pause briefly periodically during my presentation to see if anybody has any question. If not, we can also take up some questions at the end for discussion. Okay, let me go back to my slides here. Another important point that I would like to mention is that good quality research should always not only be programmatic, but it should also involve the potential end users of the knowledge that you're going to generate through the research. And as you can see here from this chart, each of the 5 major phases of the 15-year research program that I'm talking about here was done in conjunction with and with support from major companies. I'm not going to go through all of these companies here. Some of these I'm sure you're familiar with, like Visa and AT&T and so forth. So in each of these different phases, multiple companies from different sectors were all involved. And this again is another benefit of having a research funded through this Marketing Science Institute, because the Marketing Science Institute, in addition to providing funding for the research, if the research proposal is good, they also kind of link you up with companies that can serve as context for actually operationalizing your research and doing your research. So that's an important. The industry academia collaboration is also an important, very important ingredient of doing impactful management research. So now I'll briefly kind of elaborate on each of the 5 phases. As I mentioned, the main output of the first phase of our research journey was qualitative. By qualitative research in this case, we mean a lot of different focus group interviews that we did with customers in the various sectors that you saw on the previous chart. And we also did a lot of in-depth interviews with managers. In other words, we looked at both the customer side of the equation, so to speak, and we also looked at the service organization or the service company side. In the service company side, we did a lot of qualitative research interviews with employees and supervisors and managers at different stages, different levels of the organization. On the customer side, we did a lot of focus group interviews with customers in various sectors. So based on very thorough and systematic analysis of qualitative research data, the focus group data, and the in-depth research, interview data, we came up with the so-called GAPS model of service quality. And the GAPS model is very, very simple, actually. And it basically says that when customers evaluate the quality of service, in other words, how good the quality of service is, they compare the actual service that they are receiving, that they think they are receiving from a company, with what they expect the company to receive, with what they expect the company to receive from an excellent, what they expect to receive from an excellent company.
Yeah, sir. Can you present it again, because we can't see the presentation.
Oh, you lost the slides?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. Let me see. I don't know. Something is. I'm sorry about that. Let me see if I can redo it.
Yes, sir. It's coming now.
Coming? Okay, are you able to see it now?
It's visible, sir.
It's visible. Okay, all right. All right, so to kind of quickly recap what you probably heard me say earlier is that we did a lot of qualitative research both on the customer side and the service company side. And from the customer side, the quality of service is defined as any potential discrepancy between what the customers expect to receive from an excellent organization vis-a-vis what they actually perceive that they are getting from a given organization. And typically there's a disconnect. Now you can think of your own experiences, and you probably have these kind of minor irritations, sometimes major irritations, because you didn't really get what you expected to get from a company. So that is the service quality gap on the customer side. So if you label that gap as gap 5, from the qualitative data that we gathered and analyzed from the service company side, we were able to identify four major internal organizational shortfalls, gaps 1, 2, 3, and 4, that in turn result in or lead to this external gap 5. So the whole idea behind the gaps model is that to truly improve quality of service, you need to systematically diagnose, analyze, and close these internal gaps 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, we don't have time to go through all of these gaps in detail, but just to give you an idea, these are all almost self-explanatory. For example, if you look at gap 1, I'm labeling this the market information gap, meaning that there is often, even to this day, a disconnect between what customers' actual expectations are and what managers and organizations think customers' expectations are. For example, I'll share a personal example. About 3 years ago, I was staying at the Sahara Star Hotel in Mumbai. Some of you may have been there or at least heard of it. It's a major 4-star, 5-star hotel just outside the Mumbai International Airport. And when I went up to my room, everything was looking very nice and visually appealing and attractive. And I noted with some curiosity that there was a interesting looking high-tech, bedside control panel right next to the bed with a lot of different buttons. You can push any button to control, for example, the lighting in the room, the closing and opening of the curtains in the room, turning on and off of the TV, of the air conditioner. So there were at least like 25, 30 buttons on the screen. So the hotel has obviously invested a lot of money and effort to kind of place these bedside electronic control panels beside the bed in each of their rooms. So at first, I was amazed by how high-tech this service was. But the problem was that it took me about half an hour, even though I have a mechanical engineering degree, to figure out how the electronic control panel worked. So it took me some time to figure out all of the different controls. Then I thought, okay, now I mastered it. So then I went for a series of meetings outside the hotel, and then I came back late at night, ready to go to bed. And the problem was that, I could not turn off the lights that I wanted to turn off. I would press one button, instead of the light turning off, the curtain would start going up. So I was obviously pressing the wrong button. So maybe I was confused and too tired, whatever it is. So it didn't accomplish what I wanted it to do. For example, there's a light on in the bathroom, and the light was coming from under the door of the bathroom and bothering me. I couldn't get the room to darken. So I said, okay, let me get out of bed and actually go and turn off the light manually inside the bathroom, but there is no manual switch inside the bathroom. So you have to do it from the control panel. So a lot of irritations like this kind of really took away from my overall experience at the hotel. And on top of that, there are also a lot of other fatal flaws. For example, I asked for a wake-up call in the morning, never got the call. I had ordered breakfast, and then the breakfast was delivered late, and it was not what I had ordered. So there are a lot of different basic aspects of the service that they did not provide. But they have this fancy-looking, very expensive electronic control panel, which at the face of it seemed like would be a very good service to add, especially in this day and age when everything is kind of high tech, but actually didn't do the job and in fact aggravated this external service quality gap 5 for me, at least from that experience. So the point I'm trying to make here is that a lot of times companies tend to assume what customers' expectations are and what is likely to be appealing to customers without really understanding fully what the customer's basic expectations are. And that's the market information gap. So like that, there are these other gaps, service standards gap, which has to do with, even when companies have knowledge of what the customer's expectations are, do they really translate that knowledge into concrete specifications for their own service? And the third gap is the service performance gap, which basically asks the question, so we may have some internal performance standards, but are we able to meet our own standards or not? So that's the key question here. And then the last gap here is what I label an internal communication gap. And that's this internal communication gap, or gap 4, is the disconnect between different departments or different touch points within the organization that may all come in contact with the customer. For example, the marketing department might promise certain things to customers, but it's really the responsibility of the operations department to actually deliver on what was promised. But the problem is the marketing department doesn't talk to the operations department. So there's an internal communication gap that in turn aggravates or contributes to the external gap 5. So as I mentioned, the main takeaway from this is that there is a series of disconnects within organizations, serious gaps within organizations that all need to be closed in a systematic fashion in order to close this external gap and improve quality of service. So again, this is not really rocket science, but the gaps model has had a tremendous impact on the workings of many organizations. It serves as a blueprint, so to speak. It serves as a blueprint that companies can use as a starting point for system, and not just companies, but any service organization can use as a starting point to diagnose where their service quality issues are. Are we meeting? Do we know what our customers' expectations are? Question number 1. If we know what our customers' expectations are, do we really faithfully transform those expectations into specifications for what we deliver and how we deliver and so on? If we do have specifications, do we have the resources and wherewithal to actually deliver those expectations? And then finally, are we communicating truthfully and accurately in terms of what we are capable of delivering to customers? So that's the overall gaps model. So again, as I said, this is not a very esoteric model, but the point I would also like to make is that why is this gaps model so impactful? In my opinion, it has been so impactful not because it is very sophisticated. In fact, quite the opposite. I think its impact really stems from the fact that it's pretty simple to understand. But it is backed up with a lot of appropriate research. It's not something that we as researchers in one fine day came up with. In fact, the gaps model took 2+ years to develop. As you can see, we had to do a lot of interviews, both with customers and with company personnel and then analyze all of those interview transcripts and data, and then extract the main themes that resulted in this gaps model. So doing impactful research involves looking systematically at the issue of interest and then doing the research in a way that is appropriate for the problem. It's not just applying quantitative techniques or tools and techniques. It is what do we know? If you don't know much, then you have to start with qualitative research, and that's what we did here. The second phase was quantitative, and it produced the SERVQUAL instrument. Going back to the previous slide, the second phase, we said, okay, now that we have this overall blueprint of the gaps model, what should be a logical continuation of a research stream? We said, oh, okay, to be able to fully understand these gaps, we need to start measuring these gaps. So let's start with just this external gap, customers' expectations versus perceptions. So we did a series of quantitative empirical research studies to try and operationalize this gap 5, in gap 5 alone. So that's what produced the SERVQUAL instrument. That again took 3 years to develop. Here we did a lot of surveys, actual quantitative surveys to measure customers' expectations and their perceptions on each of these 5 different dimensions: tangibles, reliability, responsiveness, assurance, and empathy. And deriving these dimensions themselves, again, these are not dimensions that we just came up with. We had to start with a lot of qualitative research. Based on that, try to understand what kind of parameters customers are using to assess the expectation versus perceptions gap, and then develop questions to measure those expectations and perceptions. And then we gathered a lot of quantitative data, and we did use a lot of techniques like regression analysis, correlation analysis, factor analysis, to be able to come up with these 5 dimensions and the final SERVQUAL scale. So that is the second phase. And just to give you an illustration of some of the key findings from our empirical, from the second empirical phase of our research program, when we asked customers to allocate a total of 100 points across the 5 major dimensions of service quality, we found something interesting, as you can see here. The dimension that was most critical from the customer's point of view across different sectors was reliability, with roughly a third of the allocation going to reliability. And the dimension that was least critical, at least as perceived by customers, was tangibles. Tangibles has to do with external appearances. For example, the appearance of the service facility, the appearance of the people delivering the service, the appearance of brochures, communication materials, and so on. And for the same companies, when we did a gap analysis to see where the major gaps were along the 5 dimensions, again, here, just to explain this chart, in this chart, on the y-axis, we have the P minus E, perception minus expectation gap overall. So a gap of 0 here would mean that customers' expectations and perceptions exactly coincide. When the customer's perceptions exceed expectations, the scores will be positive. When the customer's expectations fall short of expectations, the scores will be negative. And then on the horizontal axis here, we have the 5 major dimensions of SERVQUAL. And this is just, a summary of empirical results that we found from a multi-sector study. This is just an overall chart. And what's interesting, what I find interesting here is that on the dimension of tangibles, by and large, across different companies and different sectors, we found that companies actually slightly exceed customers' expectations. But then on the remaining 4 dimensions of service quality, there are big negative gaps. In fact, the most negative gap is on reliability, which is the most important dimension, as we saw from the previous chart. In the pie chart, as we saw, customers are saying of all 5 dimensions important, but the most important above and beyond everything else is reliability. Reliability has to do with whether the company delivers on its promises. What was promised actually delivered. Tangibles is also important, but not as important as some of these other things. particularly reliability. And yet, most companies try to sort of spruce up their facilities, spruce up the appearance, spruce up the appearance of their personnel, their communication materials, and so forth, and not pay enough attention to some of these other so-called softer dimensions, particularly reliability. So the empirical results here seem to sort of support the notion that there is a disconnect here between what customers want and what companies are providing. So with that analysis, we proceeded to the third phase, which produced this so-called extended gaps model. The genesis of this is that you know, with the development of the SERVQUAL instrument, we got a pretty good idea of the left-hand side of the gaps model. In other words, the perception versus expectations gap on the customer side. We said, now we need to also get a better understanding of gaps 1 through 4 on the company side, and that was the genesis of this particular phase of this research. So once again, we started out with a lot of qualitative research to try and understand what are the basic reasons why gaps 1, 2, 3, and 4 exist within organizations. So once again, here by qualitative research, we mean doing a lot of focus group interviews with employees, especially frontline employees within an organization, along with in-depth interviews with supervisors and managers and so forth, trying to understand what are some of the challenges they faced. So based on all of that, we developed this so-called extended gaps model. So on the right-hand side, you see the SERVQUAL dimensions, which kind of emerged from the second phase of our research. So really what we added in the third phase was this left-hand side, where for each of the 4 gaps, we were able to identify a series of potential causes of those gaps. Just for the sake of illustration, I have included just one major factor. For example, for gap 1, which is the market information gap, one of the main factors we identified was poor upward communication. Poor upward communication refers to a lack of proper communication between the frontline workers in an organization and their upper level managers, supervisors, and so on. So in our research, we found that people in the front lines are a lot of times much more aware of customers' expectations and their problems that they're facing and so forth. But then that information doesn't get communicated to top level managers who are in fact responsible for setting standards for the organization, goals for customer service, and so forth. So poor upward communication is a potential contributor to gap 1. So like that, we've identified a series of factors, series of potential causes of each of these 4 gaps. So we put all of this together in the form of another more expanded qualitative model, which we call the extended gaps model. And then in the quantitative phase of the same research, we tried to do, we developed measures of all of these, and then we tried to do a major empirical test using SEM, structural equation modeling technique, to do a full test, empirical test of this model. That quantitative part, the full empirical test of this model, was not as successful as we might have expected. Again, that's the point that I'm going to return to in my concluding slide. So file that away for the thing. Basically, this is the outcome of the third phase of our research program. Then, about this time in the literature, we had already published the gaps model, and we had published SERVQUAL. As some of you that have been using these techniques and know the literature about these techniques already might have figured out, about this time, we are talking about the late 1980s, there was also some criticism of SERVQUAL. There are a lot of criticisms appearing in the literature about, does SERVQUAL only have 5 dimensions, or we did a study using the same scale, and we, instead of 5 dimensions, we got 6 or 7 dimensions. So that was one type of critique of SERVQUAL. Another type of critique had to do with, do we really need to measure customers' expectations? Because customers' expectations are always going to be high. So why even measure customers' expectations? Isn't it sufficient just to measure what customers think of our service, rather than first asking them, what are your expectations of excellent service companies, and then asking them, what do you think of XYZ company service? So these are the kinds of criticisms that are being leveled against SERVQUAL. This actually prompted us to extend our research to try and understand the nature and determinants of customers' expectations. So we wanted to do more qualitative research to delve a little bit deeper into customer service expectations. So that was the origin of our phase 4. So again, hopefully you're seeing the programmatic development of this research. It's actually the external criticisms and questions about the SERVQUAL methodology that gave us the impetus to explore further the nature and determinants of customer service expectations. So once again, we did a lot of series of focus group interviews in 8 different sectors, with customers in 8 different sectors, to see if we can develop a model of customers' expectations. And in fact, we developed a major model, which was also published in the Journal of Academy of Marketing Science in 1993, but I'm not going to go through the full model here. But one of the major learnings from this particular phase is that the so-called notion of zone of tolerance. The zone of tolerance is actually the range of expectations with an upper boundary and a lower boundary. In other words, what this research, a key learning from this research, was that when customers think of expectations, they don't always ask for the ideal high level of expectations. In fact, most customers have a range of expectations. At the top boundary of that range is what we call desired service. Desired service is the level that customers believe, service level that customers believe can and should be delivered. In other words, it's almost like the realistic ideal. Ideally, customers would want companies to deliver at this high level. And most customers also believe that if a company is really excellent, then they should be able to deliver at that level. And then at the lower end of the range is the adequate service level. Adequate service level refers to a minimum level of service with which the customers are likely to be satisfied, minimum level that they are willing to accept. So the zone of tolerance idea is an interesting idea, because it qualitatively refutes the idea that customers' expectations are always not going to be high. In fact, there is a range of expectations. And then in the final phase, quantitative phase, we said, okay, now we have the SERVQUAL scale that measures customers' expectations and their perceptions. So can we refine that SERVQUAL scale? Can we refine it to be able to incorporate this notion of not just a single ideal level of expectations, but the two different levels of expectations, and therefore the zone of tolerance. So we incorporated this qualitative notion of the zone of tolerance into our original SERVQUAL scale to produce a more refined SERVQUAL scale. So, and then of course this again involves a lot of collection of empirical data through questionnaires, analysis of the data using the various statistical techniques and so on. So it's a highly quantitative. So the result of that was a refined SERVQUAL questionnaire. And just to, again, give you a flavor for some of the empirical findings, we use the refined SERVQUAL questionnaire that measures not only a customer service quality perception, which is what is denoted by these red dots here on this chart. Again, on this chart, the x-axis has the 5 SERVQUAL dimensions. The y-axis has a 1 to 9 scale on which we are actually measuring the customer's actual service quality perception, which are the red dots. And then we are also measuring the upper boundary and the lower boundary of the zone of tolerance, the desired service level, which is the upper boundary, and the adequate service level, which is the lower boundary. So we're able to construct a picture like this based on 3 different measurements that we get from the refined SERVQUAL survey. The desired level of service, measurement number 1, the adequate level of service, measurement number 2, which is the lower boundary that gives us the zone of tolerance, or the yellow rectangle here, and then the actual perceived service level, which is summarized by these red dots here. This computer manufacturer, by the way, was IBM. These are the actual results for IBM. We actually did a B2B study where we surveyed 1,000 business customers of IBM with respect to their the customer's quality of service as perceived by those customers. And as you can see here, the best performance of IBM was along tangibles. On tangibles, the actual perceived service was slightly above the desired level of service. But in each of the other 4 dimensions, the actual perceived service was barely above the minimum expected service. There's a lot more room for improvement. Now, this is important because one of the critiques of SERVQUAL, as I mentioned before, is that you really don't need to measure expectations. One measurement, just asking for customers what they think of the service is enough. Well, in this case, if we had just asked customers, what do you think of IBM service on reliability, responsiveness, assurance, empathy, and so forth on the same scale, this is what we would have gotten. We'd have gotten these average scores, which all look pretty much right around 7.5 to 8 on a 9-point scale. So if you were to just look at this, you get, as a manager, you would get a much rosier impression of what your service is like than in reality what it is. When you superimpose the customer's expectations on the same chart, you get a totally different picture. Here, as a manager, you are unlikely to pat yourself on the back and say, good job. Instead, you would be saying, well, we seem to be spending too much on tangibles. In fact, we may be overkilling on the dimension of tangibles, which basically has to do with appearance aspects, and we are not doing enough on some of these other more important dimensions. So there's a long way to go. So again, so this, from a practical perspective, the refined SERVQUAL scale, the measurement of the zone of tolerance, gives managers much more diagnostically useful and perhaps more accurate information than simple measurement of customer perceptions alone would yield. So again, I kind of rushed through these different phases, but hopefully I've given you some sense of what programmatic research really looks like. Programmatic research, in my view, should focus on a topic that is very, very important. In our case, it was quality of service, about which nothing was known in the early 1980s. So we said, okay, let's have an initial understanding of it. And then after developing the initial gaps model from the first phase of our research, we then moved on to looking at different parts of the gaps model in bits and pieces. And in each phase, in each of the phases, subsequent phases, we focused on the appropriate research technique this is where we alternated between qualitative and quantitative. So overall, this research stream spanning a period of 15 years has had quite a bit of impact in the domains of pedagogy, in terms of scholarship, as well as in terms of managerial implications. Just to give you some examples here, in terms of pedagogical impact, there have been many books and textbooks, particularly that are based on the GAPS model and SERVQUAL. So here's just a sampling of some of the books that have been published, and some of them have been published in multiple languages. Now, in terms of academic impact, this chart here summarizes a series of MSI monographs that we have published from various studies that have all been funded by the Marketing Science Institute. And the major point that I want to make here is that if you look at the chronology of these monographs, the publications themselves have alternated between conceptual articles and empirical articles. So you can see the two different shades here, yellow versus gold. So you see the alternating qualitative versus quantitative research, which in turn is resulting in conceptual versus empirically based articles. And another point I would like to make here is that each of these MSI monographs have resulted in multiple journal publications in scholarly, article publications in scholarly journals. So the point I want to make with this particular chart is that good quality, highly impactful research doesn't always have to be very technique heavy. It's not the technique that determines whether the article is impactful or not. What determines that is that what type of knowledge is it producing, and is that knowledge appropriate for the particular problem? And it can be qualitative articles can be as impactful as quantitative articles, or conceptual articles can be as impactful as empirical articles. Again, another measure of academic impact are the citation counts. So the original GAPS model here, these are Google Scholar citation counts. The original GAPS model was published in Journal of Marketing in 1985, as I mentioned before. It has close to 33,000 citations now. And here are some books and other publications that also have high citation numbers. Then if you look at SERVQUAL, SERVQUAL was first published in the Journal of Retailing in 1988, and the citation count is nearing 36,000. And there are other related articles on SERVQUAL that also have high citation counts. Now, in terms of practitioner impact, here's just a selection of different companies around the world with which I've personally been involved in to talk about the GAPS model, to engage in consulting projects, and so forth. And there are a lot more other companies that have used the GAPS model and are SERVQUAL as well. So impactful research not only is research that gets published in the scholarly journals, but also makes a difference for companies. And then in terms of international impact, this chart shows you the list of different countries in which I have participated in scholarly research as well as presentations and consulting projects, all relating to the service domain. All right, this is my last slide. So I just want to conclude the talk with some lessons that I've learned and also some suggestions that I'd like to offer. First, I think it's important, especially for budding scholars, to choose a domain or a topic that has evolutionary potential, even if it's risky. What I mean by evolutionary potential is that it is a topic that is new enough and important enough that just one project may not be able to answer all of the questions that are involved in it. So sometimes, those really new topics could also be somewhat risky in the sense that you really don't know what you're going to get. Whereas a more opportunistic type of research project might be much safer. So for example, you do a survey and apply a certain technique that's already well established. So it's kind of safe. You'll probably get a publication out of it, but in terms of impact, it's going to be much lower than if you start to work on a domain or a topic that has not been researched that thoroughly, or a very new topic, and then successively start working on research projects that are interconnected, like the 5 different phases that I shared with you from my own research training. Choose research colleagues with similar core values but complementary skills. Again, I mentioned in one of my opening slides that I owe Professors Leonard Berry and Professor Valerie Zaitamo a deep sense of gratitude for introducing me to this whole area of services. But apart from all of us having a common interest in services, each of us, brought different skills to the table. For example, by training and by my initial educational background, I'm much more technique and modeling oriented type of person. Valerie has a much more in-depth knowledge of consumer behavior, and Professor Leonard Berry has a very practitioner orientation. So we had complementary skills that we brought to every one of our research projects. So this is an important point, especially for young scholars, because again, the normal tendency among young scholars is akin to birds of a feather flocking together. What I mean by that is that, you have a tendency to work with other colleagues that are working on the same techniques or the same topics. So which per se is not bad, but I think you might get more mileage for your research investments in terms of impact if you choose research colleagues, if you're able to choose research colleagues that have similar core values but bring complementary skills. For example, one of the main things I would suggest in this day and age is to go outside your own discipline. For example, marketing people should work with computer science people, I would say, to bring some new insights from computer science and technology to the marketing area. So you shouldn't be afraid to go beyond your discipline and work with other colleagues from other disciplines. Conduct your research in multiple sectors or contexts. And again, as I mentioned earlier, each of the various phases that I briefly touched on today involve at least 4 different sectors. So this is important because doing the same research in multiple contexts makes the results of the research much more robust, much more applicable. In fact, it also helps you withstand criticism of the following nature. They might say, if you do a study in a particular context, a reviewer might come back and say, well, your context was so unique, so what's the assurance that the same thing will work in some other context? So if you start out proactively by focusing on multiple contexts and demonstrating the robustness of your results across sectors, then that makes your research that much more impactful and also much stronger. Be realistic. Don't bite off more than you can chew, particularly in a single project. This is an important lesson that I learned, again, to go back to one of the things that I mentioned in passing. In the 3rd phase of our research, there was a quantitative phase where we, as I mentioned, we did a SEM, structural equation modeling test of the entire extended GAPS model. And that was not very successful at all because we were trying to do too many things. Our empirical portion of the extended gaps model study did not yield much, useful results or interpretable results. So the empirical part was actually too much to do. So try to focus on a few things and do them really well rather than getting carried away with your own success and become too ambitious, trying to cover too much and not doing well on any aspect of a multi-pronged type of project in one study. Don't bite off more than you could chew. Seek out a reputable external agency that can serve as a catalyst for supporting and critiquing your work. In our case, it was the Marketing Science Institute. By the way, those of you that aren't familiar with the Marketing Science Institute, I urge you to go to their website. It's just msi.org. Especially if you're in marketing, you must visit their site because there's a lot of useful information there about, what are the really hot areas in marketing that are really the new areas that are thirsting for new knowledge to be developed. What are the current research priorities? Those are all things that you can find out from MSI's website. So for our research, the Marketing Science Institute has served as a sounding board for testing out our preliminary findings and getting feedback. You may not always have an MSI, but maybe within your department you can have an internal seminar series where you present your research or interim results from your research to your colleagues and get feedback from them. Disseminate your findings through different types of publication outlets and forums to reach diverse audiences. This is also important because just getting an A-level publication in a scholarly academic journal may not be as impactful as doing that, but in addition also writing up the same article or the same findings in a much more approachable and readable fashion through, for example, a business publication, not a scholarly journal publication, but publishing an article in a business journal or giving a press interview. So try to disseminate your findings through multiple types of forums. Last but not least, work hard, be patient, and be prepared to face and respond constructively to criticisms of your work. So when you're doing important work, especially when you're tilling new ground, so to speak, when you're breaking new ground and doing some research, there is always room for criticism. So you need to view those criticisms constructively and try to learn from the criticisms and get even better as you move through your research phase. And again, as I mentioned, in my own 15-year research stream initially, there's a lot of criticism of SERVQUAL as soon as it initially came out, and this criticism actually motivated us to do some additional things and also get better as researchers. So with that, let me stop. Once again, I apologize for having to rush through all of this, but hopefully I planted some seeds in your minds that will hopefully be helpful to you as researchers and germinate into something useful down the road. So let me stop here and see if any of you have any questions or would like to engage in any discussion.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful session. Sir, there are some questions in the comment section. If you can.
Okay. Okay, let me see. Okay, I'm just opening up the comment
sections also.
section. Yeah, let me see. So Tahir, if you're able to see that, I'm having a little difficulty here. So maybe you can pick one or two questions.
First question is, how experiential marketing research domain is different from service research domain?
Okay. Now I'm also able to see those. Yeah. So, I would say, services marketing, one of the major topics right now is this customer experience management, our CEM. So I would say that it is kind of the outgrowth of service. And, as some of you might know, one of the major paradigms in the service research domain, service marketing domain now is the so-called service dominant logic, right? The SDL. Some of you might have heard of that, the Lush and Wargo paradigm, the service. And the basic thesis behind this paradigm, it's about 16 years old, but it's highly cited research paradigm. And that paradigm basically says that nowadays everything is a service. You may be selling an automobile, but you're actually selling a service because it's the experience that the customer gets out of the automobile that really determines the value that they derive from the car or vehicle. And that is really what service is all about. So I would say, customer experience management and, service excellence are sort of two sides of the same coin. Okay, so, I'm reading another question here. There are certain industries that are completely shut, like tourism and travel. Which gap is currently most crucial in terms of COVID-19? Or how should the industry people look at the gap now? That's a very interesting question. I think COVID or no COVID, that all four gaps that I talked about are still important. So I think the COVID pandemic is going to pass. I mean, we don't know when exactly, but it'll be over. It'll be over, and there'll be a new type of normal. Hopefully, starting next year, we'll have a new normal. And some of the things may never come back to the pre-COVID normal. For example, I think online teaching might evolve into more like a hybrid type of model. So there are certain technology-based offshoots of the COVID era, so to speak, that are likely to continue. But then there are going to be other aspects that are still going to be there. So if you ask me which gap is more important, tourism or other, the travel industry, they have been very, very severely affected. But those industries would evolve, and they would still be the, understanding gap one, for example, what are really customers' expectations? The customers' expectations might be different, but the basic dimensions on which those expectations exist are unlikely to change. For example, reliability, we said, is very, very important. What is reliability? Reliability has to do with delivering to customers what you promised to deliver. So regardless of how you transform yourself as a company, you're still going to have to worry about, what do our customers want in this new, post-COVID era? And are we really equipped well as an organization or as a company or as an institution to deliver on those expectations? So I would say that I think the nuances of some of these gaps might vary, but the basic gaps should still be very applicable. Okay, I'm just going down the line here. Sir, what is the scope of MBA for engineering students? Now, these are questions that go beyond my domain of expertise, but let me just give you my 2 cents worth. I think an MBA and engineering can work together, because engineering, I'm an engineer by training. My basic degree is in engineering. Then I moved to an MBA. Then I became an academic. So thinking back, I've forgotten most of my engineering. I don't know. But then I still think, after 45 plus years in the academic career, I still feel that my engineering training is really what gave me the skills to think through systematically the softer, the touchy-feely types of issues that are associated with, commonly associated with service. So developing SERVQUAL, for example, was highly facilitated by my engineering thinking at a very, very macro level, obviously. So I think engineering and MBA can be a very good combination. It's up to you to kind of take what you learn from each of those two disciplines and then weave them together to address the needs of the day, is how I would say. Okay, let me see if there's any other question. Okay. Are there any minimum number of measurements for measuring the impact of a construct in a thesis? I would say no. Minimum number of measurements. There is no magic number. And again, that I go back to some of the things that I hopefully at least implied during my talk, which is that, the number of measurements and the type of measurements you make have to be dictated by the issue that you're trying to research. If you're dealing with a topic where not much is known, your research methodology will be much more qualitative than it is quantitative. And if it is qualitative, then you need to do the types of qualitative techniques that are most appropriate. In my example, I said that we used a lot of focus group interviews and in-depth interviews. So those are the appropriate techniques. Now, one thing I might say is, you might, even if you're doing qualitative research, because that's the most appropriate research for the type of problem, let's say, that you picked, I would say make sure you do it in multiple contexts, a point that I already made. Keep it in, do it in multiple contexts so that you get more robust results, so that any patterns that you get actually cut across a sector. So, a short answer to your question is that I don't have any minimum number of measurements to suggest. Sir, the service quality is one of the most explored area in research journeys, from SERVQUAL to eSERVQUAL to mobile service quality. I'm curious to know what are this new area of research domain related to service quality. So again, yeah, you're absolutely right. I didn't talk about it explicitly during my presentation. From SERVQUAL, we kind of evolved to eSERVQUAL. Now, there's also this TechQual, which is a kind of combination of e-service quality and technology quality. So if you're asking for a new area of research domain, I would say, what is the role of technology in the delivery of services? So how is high-tech service different from high-touch service? So I think that's a very rich area for research. I myself am doing some work in that area. And what is the right combination? What is the right combination of high-touch versus high-tech delivered service? Again, one of the reasons I think this is a ripe area is that many companies, just because high tech is available, are jumping onto this high tech bandwagon, and adding all kinds of high tech bells and whistles to their offerings, without really thinking about, are the customers really expecting all of these things, or are all customers expecting all of these things? What my own research shows in the area of technology readiness is that not all customers are equally enamored by all of these cutting-edge technological gadgets. So I think there is a lot of room for getting a better understanding of what is the role of technology in service delivery, and what types of technologies and what types of high-touch versus high-tech sort of touch point allocations are appropriate in different contexts. So I think that's a very good area to look into. Sir, do you believe that COVID will change the TR behavior as well? I don't think so. My definition of technology readiness, or TR, is that it is kind of like an inherent personality trait. Technology readiness is the inherent personality, attitude or trait of people in terms of their enthusiasm and excitement and embracing these various technologies. So I don't think that's going to be changed that much. Of course, because of COVID, we are doing all of these. For example, we are now interacting via technology. But post-COVID, once again, the people that were, low TR people to begin with, they might go back to the same old, preference for high touch as opposed to high tech. So I would say my own feeling is that it's not going to change that much. In healthcare, along with service, what are the other constructs to research? Healthcare is a very important domain. I think service quality is a big part of healthcare, because most healthcare consumers they don't have the technical expertise to judge the quality of medicines or the quality of medical care that they are getting and so forth. But they are all equipped to assess the experience that they are having in availing themselves of healthcare service. So the other constructs that are probably equally important and likely to become increasingly important have to do with healthcare behavior of consumers. For example, changes in behavior that are necessary to make countries and populations healthier, live healthier lifestyles. Lifestyle changes that are required. For example, one of the ill effects of technology is that we have become like slaves of technology. We don't go outdoors anymore. All of the kids, for example, are playing on their computers. They don't go out to play. I hardly see as many kids playing out anymore. So what are some of the behavioral negative consequences of technology? Because that is related to health of a nation, health of a population. So there are very, very interesting, I think, problems and issues at the intersection of technology and service and consumer behavior. So if you can get like a cross-functional team of researchers from these different domains, then that might actually be very productive. Let's see, when a new researcher takes up an unexplored and very new upcoming area, how should they prepare for the future risks and opportunities? Again, this is a very good question. I mean, this is the trepidation that I had in my own career when I first took up the service quality research stream. As I said, I didn't do my dissertation in this area. Service was not an area that I began my career with. In fact, the first 10 years of my research, I was well engrossed in the sales management, industrial marketing area. To give that all up, and I was publishing well, in those areas as well. So to give that all up and move into this new area called customer service and quality of service, which was all new to me, was a very risky proposition. But again, given its evolutionary potential, I did decide to take a plunge into it. But I went about it in a very systematic fashion. So I think by going about it in a very systematic fashion, not being sort of driven by techniques per se, but more being driven by what is it that I want to answer as a researcher and what is the appropriate way to answer it. Thinking deeply about those things and not really sort of, picking techniques off the shelf and saying, okay, I'm going to do something in the area of service or in this new area using this technique. So the technique should not be driving the research design. The problem and the issue should be driving the research design. So that way you're mitigating the risk of failure. And still there may be other risks, like, the findings may be open to criticism. Like I shared with you my experiences that SERVQUAL received a lot of criticism in the literature. but then use that criticism initially was very jarring, very discomforting, because, very disheartening, in fact. But then I turned that around and used that to become a better researcher. So how do I respond to the criticism was itself like a research challenge. And that in turn led to more studies and more in-depth investigation. So I think in one nutshell, I would say to mitigate the risks and to capitalize the opportunities, plan ahead and be systematic in your approach. So it's a lifetime opportunity to listen to you, and just amazed by your commendable research journey. I want to know from you whether the factors influencing service quality changes across industries. Then in relation to financial service quality, can you apply the gaps model and how? This is interesting. So again, I'd say in a fairly macro level, I think all 5 dimensions of service quality, of SERVQUAL, can apply to any industry. In fact, we developed a scale called ESQUAL for electronic service quality, our website service quality. So there are some articles that I've written where I make a comparison between electronic service quality and traditional service quality, which is a SERVQUAL scale. And there's a lot of similarities across the dimensions. So I don't think at a macro level, the dimensions are really going to change. But there may be some minor nuances that will change because of the technologies. And therefore, whether it's financial service quality or some other service quality, I think the gaps model is still very, very applicable. Okay, how to frame a question. I don't know how much time do we have, Tahir?
Sir, we are past the actual time.
Past the time, right? So let me stop here because there are a few more questions. I'm sorry.
Sir, excuse me, I have a question. Sir, this is Shamim
Firdaus. Here, and thank you once again for your.
Sir, I have a question. May I please?
Yes. Okay.
Hello. Sir, this is Shamim Firdaus. I'm a Commonwealth scholar, a chartered accountant by profession, as well as a graduate of London School of Economics. By the way, sir, we have already entered into the domain of industrial fourth revolution. Revolution and technology is actually, dominating the industry right now. So in this scenario, sir, how actually we could make research which will, not only be publishable but also be applicable. In this scenario, sir, would you please provide us some suggestion that in the industrial fourth revolution scenario, how we could, measure the service gap instantly by the use of technology, please? Thank you very much.
Yeah, and again, I think the most important piece of advice I would give you is that, interact with your stakeholders. Who are the potential users of the knowledge? Involve and interact with them as much as you can right at the beginning stage of your research or research project. And that interaction will actually open the door to issues that you need to focus on. And then once you identify those issues, you as a researcher, then you develop a systematic approach and periodically keep in touch with the potential stakeholders so that you don't stray off course. And again, I'm basing that based on my own research journey that I've talked about. So it's very, very important to continue to interact with the potential users of the research. So I would say, just follow that piece of advice. So let me stop here. Thank you very much, and I also wish you all the best for the rest of the workshop. I'm sure it'll be a very, very productive and useful experience for you.
Thank you very much.